Under most circumstances, I like to use this channel to talk about things that I like. That's because, like most people, I enjoy talking about things that I enjoy. Even in the most uninspiring of cases like Azurlane, Kantai Collection, or Higehiro, I try to highlight the little specks of enjoyment I had with them, even if the overall experience was mediocre at its best. What I'm trying to say here is that it really takes something quite special for me to feel motivated enough to talk about something I overwhelmingly dislike. Tomodachi Game is a special little gem that is pretty easily one of the worst things I've ever seen. As you could tell by the thumbnail, I think this anime is pretentious, overcomplicated, oversimplified, and quite frankly, a disrespectful experience for the viewer. It simultaneously has too much and too little characterization, too much and too little suspense, too much and too little confidence. There are multiple times where the anime is presented with several perfectly acceptable answers to a scenario it creates, yet it somehow always manages to choose the most incorrect outcome. The main character is the most insufferable character I've ever seen in anything, and the anime refuses to let off the gas with how insufferable he can be. The anime even ventures into territories of both accidental and intentional sexism, and I can only hope that the accidental parts are actually accidental. It should go without saying, but this video will contain spoilers for Tomodachi Game. This video will exclusively focus on the anime. The manga isn't in my realm of concern, and to be honest, I'm not that interested in checking it out in the first place. Even if things in the manga are drastically different and it turns out that the anime just isn't a faithful adaptation, I genuinely have zero interest in reading it. This should go without saying as well, but if you personally enjoyed the Tomodachi Game anime, then that's great. It's going to sound a bit disingenuous coming from me after how I opened this video, but the intent of this video isn't to take away from anybody's enjoyment of the product. I don't like Tomodachi Game, and this video is about why I don't like it. It's as simple as that. My myriad of issues with Tomodachi Game can all be rolled up into a single point that I have in common with the anime, that being that it thinks that it's being more clever than it actually is. Holy shit, that's 3 fucking that's back to back to back. The premise of the anime is that there are 5 friends, Yuichi, Shiho, Tenji, Shibe, and Kokorogi. They and their classmates gathered a total of 2 million yen in order to fund their class trip, which mysteriously disappears one day. Shortly after this disappearance, the 5 are essentially kidnapped and thrown into what is known as a Tomodachi Game, with the group being told that they now collectively have a debt of 20 million yen, which equates to just about 150,000 US dollars at the time of writing this. The Tomodachi Game is a series of games with specific complex rule sets that, when cleared, present an opportunity to reduce the debt that one individually owes, but at the cost of somebody else's debt increasing. On paper, you can clearly tell that the intent behind this premise is to see how the bonds of friendship are strained when a large amount of money is involved. Do you try to save the group, or do you try to save your own skin? The problem is that while the premise is established and the anime will remind you of this fact multiple times, the anime never actually goes through the effort of setting up the necessary details to make this premise even remotely functional. It certainly thinks that it does when it comes to some of the less important details, but the aspects of the experience that should serve as the backbone for this premise are flimsy at best and non-existent at worst. Every single character manages to be wholly uninteresting and underdeveloped when it matters, while the stakes at hand are basically impossible to take seriously. A lot of the big reveals that the anime's suspense hinges on relies upon going back to overemphasize the most superficial details, retconning scenes, or even worse, straight up making things up. This is all happening while the anime is painting everything as a big fucking deal, combined with writing that ranges anywhere from edgy to childish, topped off by a visual presentation that takes itself way too seriously for the context at hand. In short, Tomodachi Game only knows how to be clever on the surface, while peering inside will reveal that there's little to no foundation to support it. The way the anime is structured made structuring this video quite easy. The anime consists of a pre-Tomodachi Game prologue, 3 whole official games, and the Tomodachi Game in real life challenge, parentheses gone wrong. We're going to skip the prologue section initially and come back to it, as there are problems caused by the prologue that appear later on, which makes it a bit difficult to discuss the prologue right away without knowing what those problems are. We'll do the 3 official games followed by the IRL game and squeeze the prologue in there somewhere. Each section will begin with a recollection of the rules before going over all of my problems with that game, which will range anywhere from the most petty and nitpicky complaints about irrelevant details to critical structural issues with the game or unaddressed gaping holes in the story. The thing that I need to address here, and this is perhaps the most important point about this video, is that a lot of what's going to be said in this video is from a perspective with hindsight. My rewatch is what shaped and locked in a lot of my thoughts for Tomodachi Game, so my experience with going through it for the first time won't be brought up here very much. So while I'm going to be bringing up the benefit of hindsight every so often, I think it's important to note that what's mainly being cataloged here is not about the first time experience. So now that we've covered our bases, let's begin. Game 1 is the Kokuri-san game. Everybody stands around a table and takes turns asking a yes or no question that has been presented to them in an envelope. Once the question has been asked, all participants put their finger on a large coin while thinking the answer to themselves. If everybody agrees on the correct answer for just one question, then the coin will automatically move to that answer and the game is considered cleared. If even one person disagrees, then Kokuri-san will favor the minority and push the coin to the incorrect answer. You are only allowed to speak while asking a question, and speaking out of turn will result in your present debt doubling. When the game is cleared, the group receives 2 million yen as a whole, which equates to 400,000 yen being carved off of everybody's debt since there's 5 people. However, if all questions are answered incorrectly, then the person with the most debt by the end is penalized by having everybody else's debt pushed onto them. In addition to all of this, the participants are granted a name tag which shows their present debt on its backside. If you show the backside of your name tag to anybody else, your debt instantly doubles. You are still allowed to tell people your debt at any time. Game 1 is really short. It only takes up the back half of episode 1 and the first half of episode 2, so naturally I have a lot less to say about this one compared to the other two. However, I do think that it provides an interesting case study to look over before we get into games 2 and 3. Right before I rewatched Tomodachi game in order to take more notes, I had recalled the Kokuri-san game being a lot less problematic than the other games, and that most of my issues with the anime as a whole began to crop up only with the start of the second game. Once I began watching Game 1 again, however, I quickly realized that the problems were there the entire time. I simply didn't see the problem the first time because I had yet to realize that this would become a recurring issue. I have two main problems with Tomodachi game as a whole, and these are visible from the very start. These two are A, the need to excessively explain everything, sometimes even multiple times, and B, the deification of Katagiri Yuichi. Granted, these problems aren't quite as severe compared to Game 2 and especially Game 3, but I still think it's important to acknowledge that the symptoms were there the entire time. On paper, I actually enjoy the premise of Game 1, which is something that you're going to hear me say again for another game later. Everyone is required to remain absolutely silent at almost all times as a large sum of money is hanging in the balance. You have no forms of effective communication available, and you simply have a series of yes or no questions determining the outcome of everything. The lack of communication here clearly adds a lot to the suspense of this game, and that's not even mentioning the twist that 4 out of 5 envelopes say, reader chooses the question. If the coin goes to yes, the game is cleared. If you answer no to your own question, then only your debt will be halved. Unfortunately, this suspense can't be retained for any amount of time due to the two aforementioned problems bubbling up to the surface, and they both rise up via the same method. The anime talks too much. For anybody watching this video that isn't familiar with Tomodachi game, there is a group of administrators watching the games unfold from within their secret bunker somewhere. And it's no secret that these people absolutely adore Yuichi. They just cannot keep their eyes off of him, and as the anime goes on, they refuse to stop showering this character with praise. Let's look at a quick example pulled straight out of Game 1. As the game progresses, Kokorogi ends up being the fifth and final person to read a question. Her question is, will we always be friends? Everybody reaches out to put their finger on the coin, but before Kokori-san can reveal the vote, Yuichi interrupts the moment and speaks out loud. With the way that the game had been progressing, if somebody answered no to the final question, then everybody's debt would have been pushed onto Kokorogi. Yuichi talking out of turn causes his present debt to double, making it so he would be the one to take on the collective debt if the fifth question was answered no. Yuichi explained this all to us very kindly and clearly in episode 2, and it's already pretty generously hinted at with Yuichi thinking about this exact plot in Game 1. Now, good on Yuichi for being the noble knight that he is, but the anime has the admins double down on this by talking about how Yuichi really has the traitor backed into a corner with metaphors about how the hunter is now the hunted. Given that we've yet to sink to the bottom of this abyss yet, it must seem rather petty that this is the first thing that I've chosen to complain about. And really, in the grand scheme of things, this specific example is a pretty small fish in a much larger pond. But I think this example helps highlight the basic structure of the two major problems that I outlined a minute ago. Something happens and then the anime explains why this happened. Yuichi talked out of turn and then he explained why he did so. The anime then goes the extra mile to frequently explain it again through the lenses of one of the admins who, under most circumstances, adds little to no new insight on the matter. It's not uncommon for this to then be coupled up with somebody being impressed with Yuichi. Rinse and repeat this formula ad infinitum, and it begins to wear extremely thin on you at an extremely quick pace. The repeated explanations in particular are the worst for me because of how this damages the experience in multiple ways. If these repeated explanations were more interesting, then this wouldn't be as much of an issue for me, but they aren't due to their tendency to simply regurgitate the same information. Not only is having to listen to the same explanation again tedious and boring, but in a thriller show such as this one, it drags out the suspense for way too long and begins to wear away at it. With that in mind, another example. Yuichi is the fourth person to read a question, and this is where the anime finally reveals that these cards tell the reader to choose the question with the extra conditions of a yes result clearing the game and a no result having only the reader's debt. I said it earlier, but on paper, I like this twist. It quickly and concisely reveals why these simple questions keep being answered incorrectly, while providing Yuichi a tempting incentive to keep this trend going. After this reveal, Yuichi thinks to himself for a little bit before the admins make some observations. Yuichi thinks to himself a little more, the admins observe a little more, at which point the anime smash cuts into a flashback of Yuichi helping a Kokorogi after she got bullied. It takes just a little under 3 minutes for all of this to be processed. Up until this point, there's a decent buildup of suspense. Simple questions are being answered incorrectly, and Yuichi is heckin' confused. See, despite the complaints I had and will have about excessive explanations, I never really minded Yuichi's live reactions to all of the previous questions, because it kinda works for the anime's favor as it helps establish the suspense in Game 1 and Episode 1. But once we get to Yuichi's question, this build-up starts to slow down due to the anime cutting to the admins twice and lingering on Yuichi thinking to himself before it comes to a screeching halt with the flashback. The pacing so far had been steady, if a little too fast, which helped keep the suspense building the entire time, yet the anime jumping back and forth between Yuichi and the admins to ultimately cover the same single topic before the flashback that just frankly feels like it's in the wrong episode, it kills a lot of momentum. If it were entirely up to me, I think the flashback should have been moved elsewhere, and the time spent from opening the fourth envelope to Yuichi asking his question should be reduced to either Yuichi thinking to himself or the admins observing, but not both. If all of the other questions were paced equally as slowly, then maybe I wouldn't mind it as much in its current state, even if I don't find the content present here to be that interesting. What previously took 3 minutes to answer 3 questions now requires the same amount of time to barely answer 1 question, and the extra amount of time that it takes here ends up being less interesting than the faster pacing of the earlier questions due to the repetition. Once again, I want to emphasize that the specific examples I drew upon from Game 1 are kind of small compared to later ones. We're simply using them to illustrate the commonalities found in many scenes and the general problems I have with these. There's also a secret third main problem that I have with Tomodachi game, but we'll unveil that one when the time is right. But for the rest of Game 1, let's begin to narrow down the scope and pick apart some specific issues. There's a total of 2 flashbacks shown in Episode 1. We've already talked a bit about this second one involving Kokorogi. Again, I don't have any real complaints about this one besides that it feels out of place and that it's maybe a little boring. The first one, however, leaves me perpetually confused by how Shiho acts here. Right before this flashback happens, Yuichi is trying to deduce if there was any friction in the group that could have led to someone trying to sabotage the first game. In this respect, literally nothing relevant happens in the flashback, and, well, okay, literally nothing is a little disingenuous. At first, apparently Shibe overstepped his boundaries with Shiho and got punched in the face as a result. But when Yuichi approaches Shiho about this, she says that she's not mad at Shibe anymore, but mad about something else involving Shibe and Yuichi. The anime never tells you what this something else is, and it never comes back up for the rest of the runtime as far as I'm aware. That being said, while the anime uses the word mad, the way she behaves in the scene seems more like petty jealousy or embarrassment. She's doing the classic embarrassed pointing fingers together gesture while blushing and can't maintain eye contact with Yuichi, which doesn't seem like she's particularly mad enough about anything to start throwing people into millions of yen's worth of debt. So in terms of trying to figure out what could have caused friction within the group, this flashback doesn't really cut it. Another thing that's strange to me is that Shiho says that she'll forgive Shibe, but Yuichi must tell her a secret that nobody else in their friend circle knows in exchange for this action. This scene always came off as really weird to me, because I don't see how these two things are related at all. The secret told here does come back in Game 2, so one could argue that the anime is taking the opportunity here to set it up in advance, but Game 2 takes long enough as it is, and there are plenty of other secrets that aren't set up in advance. I really don't think things would change at all if the secret came out as it does now in Game 2 and Yuichi just thinks to himself that this was something he told Shiho some time ago. As it stands, trying to add a context to this later moment in the story just makes the context itself come off as a really awkward bit of writing. The last thing that directly happens within Game 1 that I'll talk about here is the ending to Episode 1. I cannot believe that the ending to Episode 1 is the way that it is. So for those unfamiliar with Tomodachi game, let me pull up this specific shot. Take a second to think to yourself and imagine what could possibly happen after this shot. As a bonus hint, Episode 1 ends on this shot as well before the credits roll. Okay, so the group has just failed 4 out of 5 questions. Yuichi has become suspicious about a traitor within the group, and Kokorogi just asked the question of if the group will always be friends. Everyone is putting their finger on the coin with their answers silently locked in. And at this moment, Yuichi's eyes glow red and open wide before he puts on this maniacal smile and asks the group, "Do you know what color underwear Sawaragi is wearing today?" So, was there no other legitimate question that could have been asked here? The whole point is for him to speak up, so he can double his debt and mess with the traitor's plans, so he could have said anything else here. It could have even been just a cough, and it should absolutely count since in Episode 2, it's revealed that Shiho's little pip that she lets out during Game 1 caused her debt to double. If the anime wanted to commit even further to a serious tone, then Yuichi could have said something along the lines of, "I know there's a traitor here." He even specifically calls out the existence of a traitor at the start of Episode 2 anyways, but I guess the underwear is more important. Now, similar to the previous secret from the flashback, this one also comes back in Game 2, but this time around, the mention doesn't even provide any context, and the later return of this secret is completely overshadowed by something else the moment it comes out, so missing out on a bit of foreshadowing here changes nothing. I don't know if the anime is trying to aim for a random XD kind of humor angle here, or if we're supposed to take this instance seriously, which the anime's presentation seems to indicate. Yuichi's facial expression, the bright illuminated backdrop with the ashes flying by, and everybody's face dramatically cutting in is all so serious, but again, the words don't match the presentation, just like with the flashback. Once Game 1 is cleared, there's a bit of downtime between it and Game 2. Some of this time is spent with Yuichi going back to investigate the envelopes, only to find out that they contain a special ink which fades out the text after a little while. I don't have any complaints about that specific little detail, but I do find the explicit mention of a special ink to be really funny for some reason. For my actual complaint with this scene, Shiho strikes once again by trying to set up context for a future detail, but the process of trying to set up context just causes the whole scene to feel very weirdly executed. Shiho and Yuichi get to talking between the games, and Yuichi mentions that he suspected her to be the traitor at the start, given that she said that the group should just play the game without bickering over who might be responsible for the debt. Fair enough, I can accept that. But Shiho also says that she suspects Yuichi, with her reasoning being that she likes him. Again, this detail comes back later on, but it makes zero sense right now. What does her feelings for Yuichi have anything to do with him being a traitor? She doesn't expand on this, nor does Yuichi pry further into it, so we're just left with that weird moment as it stands. Let's talk a bit more about the traitor here, since that point is going to become a much more bigger topic with Game 2. The anime talks about how Yuichi's grand-ass plan of speaking during the middle of Game 1 planted the seed of doubt that one of them is a traitor. But during the short amount of pre-game time where the whole group is in the empty room, Manabu, the mascot, mentions the fact that someone in the room has a debt of 20 million, and that the stolen 2 million was used as an entry fee for the game. So you would think that this would have already planted the seed of doubt that somebody is a traitor, since one of them pushed 4 people into a situation that shoulders millions of yens worth of debt onto them without even the tiniest scrap of consent whatsoever, but I guess nobody else really wanted to think too hard about it, so Yuichi gets all the credit for it. On the same note, in Episode 2, one of the admins talks about how some people in this game are seeking to destroy relationships, and the anime very casually and non-subtly pans over Tenji eavesdropping on Yuichi and Shiho chatting. Makes you really wonder who the traitor could be, doesn't it? That about does it for Game 1, which is, just as a reminder, the shortest of all the main games present in the anime. Let's move straight into Game number 2. Game 2 is Bad Mouth Sugoroku. The game is played in periods, which I'll just be referring to as rounds from here on out. Each round, every player takes a turn to enter a booth for 3 minutes, and you are required to stay the full 3 minutes. Inside the booth is pen and paper, and you are given the choice to anonymously write something about any of the players, including yourself. You can write as many things as you want in each round, but you can also choose to write nothing. Once every player has taken their turn in the booth, the slips of paper are counted up, and Manabu reads all of them out loud. All the players react to it and do whatever they want with this newfound information. Then a God survey, which is a stream chat in the middle of the sky, votes based on the newfound information to determine which of the players became the least cool this round. The less cool you are, the more spaces you move. You can lie on these paper slips as well, but if you get caught in a lie, then you are pushed all the way to one space in front of whoever is currently in the lead. As a bonus, each space has a random plus or minus value attached to it, which changes the value of a player's debt if they land on that space. If at least one person reaches the goal, then the game is cleared. On clear, everybody is given a 400,000 yen reward, but anybody remaining on the board at the moment of clear is given an additional 1 million in debt in exchange for being able to go home for a while. Upon clear, anybody that didn't finish the game has their debt pushed onto the people who cleared it. So things are already a lot more complicated compared to Game 1 from just looking at the rules. Game 2 also happens to be the largest section of this video. Like I said with Game 1, I think this idea is neat on paper. In a perfect world where everybody trusts everyone, all players would submit a blank card every round to finish the game together, get the group-wide reward, and head into Game 3 as best friends forever. But because people are assholes, they won't do this and will start writing stuff down in order to manipulate the results based on whether they view the reward for completing or failing the game as more valuable. Game 1 very directly tipped off the viewers that Tenji is the traitor. This becomes a major factor here as a good chunk of Game 2 is told from Tenji's point of view. The anime frames his motivation as this obsessive need to control Shiho as a result of him having feelings for her, and he wants to try and isolate her from the rest of the group so that Tenji becomes the only person that she relies on. Not only did he steal the 2 million yen and use it to sign everybody up for the Tomodachi game, but he also went around doing a lot of eavesdropping and surveillance about Shiho and others to pick up on all sorts of little secrets about them. At the beginning of Game 2, everybody else is planning on submitting blank cards so that the group stays together at all times. This strategy is broken in the third round when it's revealed that one card has been submitted. Now that we've hit an appropriate cliffhanger, let's jump all the way back to the beginning of the anime and discuss the pre-game prologue in detail. In hindsight, this section being so terribly short causes a lot of damage to the anime in the long run. It spends a sweet 5 minutes to set up any baseline exposition for the characters to be propped up on, yet it can't use those precious 5 minutes well. I would almost be okay with this if we actually learned interesting things about each of these characters and the group as a whole by observing their interactions, but no, this amounts to pretty much some extremely surface level conclusions like Tenji is smart, or Shibei is dumb, or Kokorogi is shy. The anime cares very little in terms of actually establishing these characters in any shape or form and literally just gives you a quick paragraph on each of these characters that lasts just a few seconds on screen, with my favorite detail being that Kokorogi likes anime and stuff. This is followed by Yuichi thinking to himself that they will stay friends forever, or so he always thought, as the screen fades to black. Subtlety is not the anime's greatest strength, I just want to say. The entire premise of the anime is supposed to be about how everyone's friendships are tested and pushed to the limits, but I can't really take any of this seriously when the anime can't be bothered to actually detail people's personalities and relationships seriously. We're just supposed to assume that these are the bestest of friends, but nothing in the way they interact indicates this at all. The most significant interaction that we get of these characters during this prologue segment is when Yuichi talks about how he brought his money in, and then the other four take turns telling him some variation of good job. Outside of the prologue, the only evidence to support the fact that this group is a close-knit circle is a series of flashbacks scattered throughout the various games, which either come at very awkward moments where it feels like the flashbacks are interrupting something, or after the point where the illusion of these people being friends has been shattered. We never get to hear about how they got to meet each other besides how Shiho meets Tenji and Kokorogi for the first time, as well as how Yuichi got to meet Kokorogi through Shiho, which is casually snuck inside those elementary paragraphs that I'm sure everybody was bothered enough to pause and read for those 2 seconds where it barely blinks by the screen. It doesn't take Sherlock Holmes to realize that the anime gives you no reasons to believe that these people are genuinely friends with one another, and then immediately goes on to tell you that none of these people can be trusted. When the bonds are supposed to be strained later on in the anime, there is no weight to these interactions because the anime never painted out the relationships that's supposed to be tested. When it tries to do this later on, it is always too little and too late. This is what I meant in the introduction when I said that every single character manages to be wholly uninteresting and underdeveloped when it matters. For a story that's supposed to be all about testing the limits of a relationship, the anime doesn't put in any significant effort into establishing and further detailing these relationships. They're simply friends because the concept necessitates them to be, not because they actually are. This has left me to wonder if the choice of the Kokuri-san game as the first game was the right decision, due to the game's rule set reinforcing a lack of direct interaction. The main takeaway from Game 1 is that there's a traitor in the group, so nobody can be trusted, yet we know next to nothing about any of these characters, and Game 1 provides very little to help with this. Yet the later games don't really provide much to work with either, because the story keeps chugging along under the assumption that these people are best friends at the start. If Game 1 was replaced with some other game that could facilitate interactions between its characters, then perhaps the hasty opening of the anime could be forgiven, as Game 1 would be doing some of the heavy lifting that the prologue couldn't. But because it doesn't, Game 2 is where the cracks really start appearing as the anime begins to force down upon and strain these brittle relationships that don't have a solid foundation beneath them. As a result, the illusion of these people being friends shatters rather quickly as the anime continues along with its pretense of friendship. Another thing that I want to address here are the stakes of the anime. 2 million yen is the overbearing weight that hangs above everybody's head, but in the long run, this 20 million yen doesn't really matter. It sure does sound like a lot of money, but there's no context to this money. This debt just appears in front of the group. They're told that they now collectively owe 20 million yen, and that's it. The anime keeps rubbing the debt in your face repeatedly as it continues to balloon and shrink, and all this really does is make the money lose as much meaning as quickly as possible. It's like sitting there and saying the same word over and over and over and over until you realize that you're just making noise and not actually saying anything of substance. If the magnitude of the changes were far greater and these changes happened less frequently, then perhaps the debt could be taken a bit more seriously, since these changes would have some more impact to them. Game 2 is where this is taken way too far, since basically anything you do causes your debt to fluctuate. It's even worse because, spoilers, there's a short time skip partway through Game 2 where they just skip over 11 rounds worth of the game. And because of the nature of Game 2 allowing for wild and constant fluctuations in the debt, the anime could have spit out any number by the end and there would be zero way to prove it wrong. The anime doesn't care to elaborate on where this 20 million yen came from for a long time, and so it ultimately fails to gain any meaning, which just ends up being another method by which the game fails to gain any right to be taken seriously by the viewer. On the contrary, the 2 million yen that was saved up for their class trip is an example of something that's actually contextualized well and has a larger meaning. The anime actively puts this money under a magnifying glass to reveal a clear purpose for it, as well as distinct consequences that stem from a result of losing the money, that being the negative reactions of their classmates. That's pretty much it in terms of the rippling consequences caused by the hasty construction of the prologue. But before we get back into Game 2, I just have one more thing to complain about in regards to the prologue. At like 9 minutes-ish in episode 1, Manabu asks Yuichi if he suspects his friends, then the anime brings up a shot that puts down an extremely watered-down description of the other four. Clearly, the anime is using it for dramatic effect, but with the power of hindsight, this shot is just kind of hilarious more than anything else. Spoiled rich Shibe is pretty much accurate to the source since this guy's social interaction skills are so bad. I don't have much to say about the hypocritical Shiho-sama because this character does sweet fucking nothing throughout the story despite how much of a big deal the anime will be making out of her. The sly Tenji-kun is just very silly because of how much emphasis the anime puts on this character and how he's being the most evil of evil masterminds with his evilly evil plots. The sexy Yutori-chan is one that always struck me as strange though. I really don't know why sexy is the word they chose here over anything else, and it's not like finding a replacement is difficult either. I think innocent would have actually worked really well here since this is a trait of Kokorogi that becomes a point of relevance later on in the story. Even something as generic as quiet or kind could have worked fine too, but I have no idea why it had to be sexy. At the very least, traits such as spoiled rich, hypocritical, and sly try to say something about the character's personality, whereas sexy doesn't really say anything relevant about the character. Despite there being so many good answers, the anime somehow manages to pick a wrong one. As one final bonus complaint about the prologue, there's the scene where the group gathers in front of the school at night where they are promptly kidnapped by Tomodachi game staff. During this, Yuichi is the only one that's shown to get tased, whereas everybody else is just physically struggling. There's nothing bad about this, I just think it's a little weird and kind of funny. So, where were we? We left things off at a cliffhanger of there being a badmouth card written during the third round when the group made a promise to write nothing. This single card contains 2 secrets on it. Number 1, Shiho dated Tenji in the past, And number 2, Shiho currently likes Yuichi. This card is written by Tenji. Nobody besides Tenji knows of this fact, so when Manabu reveals the card, of course there's a debacle. Adding a romantic element to a friend group can certainly lead to awkwardness. However, this reveal causes a temporary but dramatic shift in personality for 2 characters, Shibe and Tenji. As we've covered, the anime hasn't done much to establish these characters, much less any intricacies in their personalities outside of some very surface level stuff. Going by this very surface level stuff, we can glean 2 things. Tenji tends to be cool, calm, and collected, while Shibe is not the sharpest tool in the shed. But once a few of Shiho's romantic secrets get revealed, Shibe, who we know likes Shiho thanks to one of the earlier flashbacks, immediately becomes aggressive and starts accusing everybody of making fun of him, even attempting to become violent. In the meanwhile, Tenji, who is supposed to be the cool, calm, and collected one, starts egging him on and picking a fight by calling him an idiot and such. There's a complete breakaway from the surface level understanding of these characters we've been provided with that makes it really hard to take this fight seriously. It's more like these two are being bad at acting and pretending to have a fight rather than a serious bit of conflict, and I understand that Tenji is also being intentional here with his aggression, but I think if Game 2 wanted to continue painting Tenji out as this sneaky, very purposeful saboteur, then they could have gone with something a lot more subtle with him here instead of just completely doing a 180 on his personality just because the fight demands it. During this fight, Tenji specifically says, "I knew Sawaragi-san likes Yuichi," and doesn't provide any explanation as to how he knows this. So Tenji effectively admits to writing one of these secrets, since the only people that should know about this from Shiho's perspective should be Shiho herself and Yuichi, as she doesn't know about Tenji having eavesdropped on her between games. If Shiho just asks Tenji, "How do you know this?" then that really should have been enough to push him into a corner. The other secret should also only be known by Tenji and Shiho if we discredit the possibilities of eavesdropping, stalking, and other similar actions. If both of the secrets that are revealed in this round can be directly linked to Tenji through admission for one of them and association for the other, this should just make him the number 1 suspect from the very start. Even without absolute confirmation, this very heavily implies that he's the one who wrote the one and only note for that round, so he would be the only person trying to stir shit whereas everybody else is trying to move together as a group. Now, there are 2 secrets revealed in this round, so there very easily could have been 2 different writers. This would be a completely fair line of thinking if the anime doesn't specifically mention that only 1 card was submitted with both secrets written on it, and because only 1 person can be in the booth at a time, there can only ever be 1 person who wrote down both secrets. All the detective nonsense that Yuichi ends up doing later on is completely pointless if everybody in Game 2 just decided to collectively put their brains together and think for a minute to realize that a lot of the signs are pointing to Tenji being the traitor. Meanwhile, the only thing Tenji says to try and deflect this line of thinking is, "I didn't write it, lol," and before calling Shibe an idiot. The other possibility could be that everybody should be suspecting Shiho as she's involved in both of these secrets, which would totally be reasonable if it wasn't for Tenji admitting the fact that he knew one of the secrets. So what exactly is this detective nonsense that Yuichi does? The climax of Game 2 begins partway through Episode 5 when Yuichi starts claiming that he can smoke out the traitor. A lot of Game 2 thus far has been viewed through the traitorous perspective of Tenji as he works on his plan to isolate Shiho from the group. He's been writing more secrets than everybody else and says things like how he'll have Shiho's back no matter what happens and all their all-purpose gaslighting tricks like telling her to notice how she's being isolated and that she should only trust Tenji. Meanwhile, your boy Yuichi has been cooking in the background, coming up with a recipe that'll guarantee to ruin the traitor's day. Now, if a lot of Game 2 is told from Tenji's point of view as he's busy trying to keep Shiho to himself, how does the anime have any time to show Yuichi doing all of this work? That's the neat part. It doesn't. Or, well, it barely does. The fact that there's detective nonsense even happening might come as a surprise to some because of how Game 2 is presented, but little did you know that I've hidden 3 traps in this video so far that have been hinting at this reveal. Sorry about this, by the way. Earlier, I mentioned how it doesn't take Sherlock Holmes to figure out that the anime gives you no reason to believe that our main group of characters are friends. Then there was the talk about how the anime puts a magnifying glass on the 2 million yen in the prologue. And thirdly, I referred to those quick paragraphs during the prologue as elementary at some point. Those last 3 sentences were some of the worst things that I've ever written in my life, and I'm sure some people are wondering what the fuck the point of all those detective references were. Well, that's because I decided to think like Yuichi, who also hid 3 traps throughout Game 2 in order to catch the traitor. And the way these traps are presented are identical to the way that I presented mine. If I specifically didn't point out these weird bits of wording, I'm sure most, if not all, people listening and or watching this video would not have thought twice about it. These kinds of details aren't well hidden, but straight up imperceptible. Now, if something becomes intentionally hidden so well that it is basically impossible to notice, then maybe it should get some credit for being hidden so damn well. And while this standard will be different from person to person, I think there's a line at which point things can go from being hidden to being imperceptible. In this case, you need look no further than when the reveal is dropped and the evidence to support it is now being put on the table. The anime calls up specific scenes and shots for this purpose, but when these were shown, I could not, for the life of me, remember the existence of these scenes. Some of you guys might hear me say that and respond by asking how that's the anime's fault and not my own goldfish memory. Well, the evidence that's specifically being brought up here are scenes and shots that were so unimportant and unremarkable at the time of their initial appearance that I simply didn't even subconsciously register the existence of these things happening. That's where I draw the line. If the evidence is provided here, even if I may not be able to pinpoint exactly when these things happened, I should still be able to recall that these things happened. When the anime takes details that were so unimportant that I didn't even register them and flaunts them as these critical pieces of evidence that will spell out the downfall of the traitor, it honestly just feels like the anime is making shit up. And on my first time through, I genuinely believed that the anime was making shit up. I don't feel impressed or astounded that the anime was able to sneak these things past me. I simply feel annoyed and unsatisfied because of how much emphasis is being put onto these minute and utterly forgettable details. I've been talking shit about these traps and how the anime presents them, but we haven't actually discussed what these things are, so let's do that. I still have more criticisms, but we should get the context out of the way. The legendary 3 traps of Katagiri Yuichi are: Number 1. He used these slips of paper to write notes to other people in order to communicate silently. Number 2. He manipulated the order in which people entered the booth through the power of suggestion. And Number 3. Yuichi secured his trust with other people by asking them to hand over their name tags. If they handed over their tags, then Yuichi would put his trust in them. For the first trap, the evidence brought up is a shot inside the booth where Yuichi is holding a pen and paper. For the second trap, it draws upon 2 shots, one where Yuichi puts his hand on Shiho's shoulder, and another where Yuichi asks Tenji to enter the booth. For the third trap, the anime fixates on a shot of somebody's name tag missing on their uniform. If I had to sort these in order of ascending frustration, it would be the first, then third, and then the second trap. I find this shot of Yuichi in the booth to be endlessly exasperating. Yuichi picking up a pen and paper is not indicative of this character doing anything out of the ordinary that would ask for attention. Taking this brief shot with no memorable qualities and expecting somebody to infer that Yuichi has some grand plans in the work is a massive stretch to say the least. If the 2 papers things was pointed out to me during my first time with the anime, I would have shrugged it off as a weird animation error and moved on. Furthermore, this scene happens in episode 2. It's not brought back up until episode 6, which gives plenty of time for such an unremarkable shot to be forgotten about. Even outside of this specific shot, nothing that ever happens inside this booth is interesting enough to warrant paying serious attention to. At best, Tenji will go inside and start thinking to himself, and that's about as much action as we're allowed to see inside the booth. Yet I think the evidence used to support the first trap is nowhere near as irritating to pick apart compared to the second and third traps. I don't think there can be a better example of imperceptibility than looking at these shots of people missing their name tags. The name tags, despite the anime making a big deal out of them in Game 1, almost loses all relevance in Game 2 until it's specifically mentioned again. If the name tags continue to remain an important focal point of Game 2, then I might be okay with this because there's a reason to keep an eye out for these from the viewer's end. In its current state, the name tags are completely out of the realm of discussion until one of the admins goes check this out and shows somebody missing these. I think expecting anybody to notice this before it's pointed out is asinine. Even if I did notice it on my first time through, I, again, probably would have chalked it up as being an animation error and dismissed it. This detail is simply too tiny and too obscure for it to feel like a legitimately satisfying reveal. The second trap is the one that frustrates me the most because it takes these completely mundane moments in the story and entirely repurposes them as being a critical component to Yuichi's overarching plans. This sort of ties back to the first trap, where being able to glean anything greater from these scenes is impossible, but it's like the pinnacle example of it. These moments have zero meaning to them, yet the anime decides that these should have meaning and goes back to add it later on. Of all the things that the anime tries to be clever about, this is the one where they phone it in by retconning a number of these shots. At least the evidence used for the first and third traps were trying something. The first one almost falls into the same style of retconning, but I'm willing to give it a pass on the basis of the anime drawing specific attention to that shot, even if it is impossible to deduce anything larger off of it. The third one manages to tuck itself away as an impossibly obscure little detail, but it is still there regardless of how impossible it is to actually notice it on a casual watch. But no matter which way you look at it, all the scenes used to support the second trap have additional meaning glued onto them without the scenes even hinting towards any relevance to the subject matter of Yuichi's traps. I generally can't stand retconning events because at best, it's an inelegant solution to an inelegant problem. At its worst, it screams laziness and lack of foresight. While lack of foresight doesn't seem like the issue here because these events are all fairly close together, the second trap certainly does feel lazily constructed. When talking about the third trap, I use the phrase legitimately satisfying reveal in order to describe what it is not. I feel that this phrase can be extended out to describe the other two traps as well, and really many of the reveals in the entirety of Tomodachi game. I never felt that all-important aha moment where everything clicks together and the picture becomes clear. It almost always felt like the anime was pulling these details and reveals from out of nowhere. And the one time where it did try to set something up in advance, it simply takes pre-existing scenes and completely twists the meaning of them after the fact, rather than setting up details in advance that come back as relevant yet familiar factors. As a side note, I don't like that the word trap is being used to describe these, because trap implies that something is being laid to catch something in it. He's not doing anything to catch the traitor in anything, he's simply doing a complex process of elimination. So now that we've covered what the traps are, let's see how Yuichi's plans played out. After the first card was written, Yuichi approaches Shiho and tells her that he wants to partner up with her in order to catch the traitor. But before they can do that, Shiho must prove that she can be trusted. In order for Shiho to prove herself, Yuichi asks her to write a secret that only she knows about him in the next round, along with handing over her name tag. The admins described it as taking the name tags hostage. Once Shiho does these things, Yuichi moves on to repeat the process with Kokorogi, with the only major difference being that Kokorogi is to write a secret about Shiho. Kokorogi does these things, and Yuichi rolls out Shibei being the traitor because nobody told Shibei any secrets, so he wouldn't be able to write them down even if he wanted to. During the final round, Yuichi suggests that everybody should have their names written on a card and submit that card with "I'm the one who applied to play the Tomodachi game" written on it. He then persuades Tenji into entering the booth first, during which Yuichi lets Shibei in on the plan, and everybody that isn't Tenji submits a blank card. Tenji does exactly as Yuichi instructed. Manabu then reveals the one and only card, exposing Tenji as the traitor to everybody. I think the biggest reason that these traps are so unbearable is that it takes everything involved with Tenji's scheming and makes them completely worthless. It doesn't matter if we got to take a peek inside Tenji's brain for 1.5 to 2 episodes, because secretly Yuichi was doing 40 different things in the background that just makes none of what Tenji did matter. His attempts to manipulate Shiho and isolate her from the game doesn't matter because she was just acting the entire time. It doesn't matter if it seems like Tenji finds a way to dodge a bullet here and there because he still hasn't dodged the missile pointed directly at his head. Nothing about the reveal is satisfying because the anime is just bombarding you with what is essentially new and foreign information that's intended to discredit everything Tenji has been working on. It just makes all the time spent feel like a waste rather than a build-up to a satisfying conclusion. I have 2 problems with this sequence of events as a whole. Yuichi says that he had a plan designed to smoke out the traitor even before the second game started, which, as an aside, I hate this line. It makes it sound like he knew exactly what was going to happen in Game 2 in advance, when in reality he should know nothing about it. There's very specific points to his plan that cannot be executed without the exact components provided by Game 2, like the notes or the booth, so without advanced knowledge, he can't have his detailed plans drafted out. If the line was just, "I planned on fighting the traitor in Game 2, then it would be completely fine, but I can't stand the line as it currently is. Maybe there's some plot twist deep in the manga that says, Yuichi secretly knew about all the contents of the different games prior to playing them, so he had every single one figured out at all times. And somehow, this wouldn't be a surprise to me if it was actually true. Anyways, 2 problems with how the traps are executed, and Yuichi says that he had a plan designed to smoke out the traitor before the second game started. He progressively eliminates people from the suspect list, as I've detailed just a minute ago, but this only happens because everybody he interacts with in this process does exactly as he tells them. Nobody even thinks for a second that Yuichi could potentially be the traitor. Outside of Tenji and Yuichi, the remaining 3 in the group don't think for themselves at all. I think the closest argument could be made for Shibe, with him jumping in to take the bullet for Shiho when she lands on the special chance square, but this moment stands as an exception rather than the standard. Yuichi is asking people to do these specific things in exchange for his trust, but Yuichi doesn't have to do anything to gain somebody else's trust. It could have been something as simple as Yuichi offering to do something the other person tells him to do in order to earn their trust. It's only fair since that's exactly what he demands of them. But no, they don't question anything Yuichi does and just follows every single one of his instructions. These people aren't actually characters. They're just tools. And I don't mean tools as in Yuichi is using them like a tool in order to accomplish his goal. While that much is true, I mean these characters are being exclusively used as a tool by the story to accomplish the goals of the story. They're not actively engaging with the story of Game 2. Yuichi and Tenji dominate most of the screen time throughout Game 2, and the remaining characters are only ever brought up if they were absolutely vital to whatever Yuichi and Tenji were scheming at the time, so they can go along with whatever these two want them to do. As a result, when the anime talks about how Yuichi puts his trust into somebody, it's more like he flipped a switch rather than it being an actually important interaction between two people and an important moment of bonding between two characters. This is my first problem with this sequence of events. The second problem is a bit more complicated to pull apart, and it's that I'm a firm believer that Yuichi stumbles into guessing the traitor correctly through sheer luck. There are several steps in this sequence where there are holes in Yuichi's plans that are patched up because things that are outside of his control just so happen to line up correctly for him. This does mean that we do need to go through all 4 of the potential suspects and explore what problems may lie in his elimination processes. Let's begin with Shiho. She's the first person that Yuichi decides to test. The reason why Yuichi chooses to cooperate with her is that she's the first person that a card is written about. In episode 6, Yuichi says that he trusts Shiho because he told Shiho to write a secret that only the 2 of them knew. She does write this down, and Yuichi claims that this is when he gained his trust for her, and that the other 2 secrets revealed in the same round could not have been written by Shiho. But here's the catch. Not only can one person submit multiple cards in each round, these cards are also anonymous by default, so just because Shiho wrote the one thing that Yuichi told her to, does not discredit the possibility that Shiho wrote the other ones, and Yuichi has no way to effectively prove that. He's just lucky here that Shiho really did happen to write the one card that she was told to write and that she wasn't the traitor. Also, instead of having the weird moment at the end of the first flashback in episode 1 where Shiho forces Yuichi to tell her a secret, Yuichi could have written down a secret on a note and passed it on to her during this game. That's essentially what's happening here anyways, with him telling her to write one very specific thing, and passing a note with a secret written on it here would just save the flashback in episode 1 from the awkwardness of its ending. In the same vein, Kokorogi is told to write something specific on a card, and she does just that. She writes a secret that only she knew about Shiho. The logic presented here is that if Kokorogi wrote a secret that only she knew about Shiho, then there was another card written during the same round, then Yuichi would know that Kokorogi couldn't be the traitor since the traitor was still active, while Kokorogi did as Yuichi instructed and definitely wouldn't write another card to fuck with him. Once again, the logic here completely forgets about the fact that people are allowed to anonymously submit multiple cards in a round. Setting that aside, this part of the plan requires Yuichi to gamble on there being another card filled in during that round outside of Kokorogi, and that this card also does not contain any secrets about Shiho. The fact that the card Tenji wrote just happened to be about himself is what makes this even work. Since if he decided to write something about Shiho, then there would be zero way for Yuichi to decipher which one was written by Kokorogi. On the other hand, if Tenji submitted nothing in this round, then Yuichi wouldn't be able to clear Kokorogi from being the traitor because that's the logic he claims to have used in order to take the suspicion off of her. There's also the fact that because this is a secret that only Kokorogi knows about Shiho, Yuichi wouldn't be able to fact check the cards written that round to see if Kokorogi's submission was even true or not. But that's a a whole nother can of worms we'll be cracking open later. Of all the shenanigans that occur here, the multiple cards rule being forgotten about twice is particularly annoying to me more than anything else. In round 8, Yuichi suggests the plan that everybody besides the person in the lead should write something about themselves. That way, the people that are behind get accelerated forwards to catch up with the lead, eventually causing everybody to be grouped together again. Tenji then simply screws with this plan by submitting 7 different cards. In episode 6, when Yuichi is explaining everything to everyone, he admits that he knew his plan for round 8 had a hole in it, so Yuichi is completely aware of this rule the entire time when his plan explicitly calls for 2 extremely specific circumstances to play out perfectly. The existence of this rule is completely forgotten about, because if anybody points it out, then Yuichi suddenly finds himself in a pickle, and the anime can't have that. Now, the anime does address this fact. Kind of. Not really, but it says it does, so we can at least hear it out. When Tenji points out the fact that anybody can write as many cards as they want, Yuichi counters this by showing him all the name tags he's collected. The intent is that if somebody isn't the traitor, then they would happily hand over the name tag, and if they aren't the traitor, then they won't be writing up a storm in that booth. The power of friendship is great and whatever, but Yuichi claiming the name tags can't actually guarantee this. Because the cards are anonymous, you could give Yuichi your name tag and still keep scribbling away, and he'd have no way to confirm whether or not you wrote it. In round 8, there's a total of 10 cards submitted. Because of Yuichi's suggestion, 3 of those should be submitted by 3 people that aren't Tenji, while the remaining 7 should be written by Tenji. But let's imagine an alternative scenario in which Tenji and 2 other people wrote 3 cards each and Yuichi only wrote 1. In this case, there would be 0 way for Yuichi to be able to deduce who wrote how many cards. For all we know, Tenji could have written 9 cards and Yuichi only 1, and the other people could have written nothing. And Yuichi can't prove this wrong. The issue with multiple cards isn't solved by the anime's proposed solution because it does nothing to solve the actual problem at hand, that being figuring out who wrote these cards. I can immediately think of one solution that would be helpful for this, which is to have something like when Yuichi clears somebody of suspicion and, he claims their name tag because that's supposed to do anything, he can tell them to put some sort of secret marking in their secret, whether it's a secret code word that they're going to be pulling out, like maybe Shiho is dedicated to exactly one code word that she should be writing in all of her secrets, and Kokorogi is dedicated to one code word that she would all be able to use it. That way, Yuichi is able to keep track of which secret belongs to which person without that person that he now trusts actively naming the cards that they've written. Shibe is sort of the odd one out in the group because Yuichi doesn't have to do anything for Shibe to clear himself. There's 2 reasons as to why Yuichi cleared Shibe of all suspicion. The first is that there would be too much risk of the traitor being exposed if they volunteered for the special chance, so if Shibe volunteered, he clearly must have not been taking this risk. Fair enough, I can accept this line of reasoning. The second is that Shibe would be unable to write any secrets about anybody else because nobody in the group has ever told Shibe a secret. While there's nothing wrong with this one, I do think it's kind of silly that this is the explanation they came up with. Everything else is so carefully plotted out, but during the middle of the explanation, Shibe just ends up catching a stray. Anyways, Yuichi's process of eliminating Shibe relies upon the fact that Shibe does all the work without Yuichi even having to lift a finger. So this leaves us with Tenji, the actual traitor. Tenji wasn't tested at all because Yuichi procedurally eliminated everybody before getting to Tenji. The reason why Tenji wasn't selected by Yuichi at any time was because it was suspicious that Tenji was not acting like himself during the game. The example he uses to back this up is when Tenji started picking a fight with Shibe back near the start of Game 2. There's 2 things I don't like about this reasoning. The first one is one that we've already talked about, that being how this scene provides a massive breakaway from the surface level understanding of Tenji and Shibe that was provided by the prologue, so that the fight becomes hard to take seriously. Tenji, who is normally supposed to be calm and collected, picking a fight with Shibe is considered abnormal behavior by Yuichi's standards, but Shibe, being the one to aggress upon people first and accusing them of making fun of him and such, doesn't seemingly fall under abnormal behavior, as Yuichi never calls him out for this. In fact, I'd say that Shibe's behavior is more at fault than Tenji's here, but Shibe's not the traitor, so he can't be faulted for that, I guess. The second thing that I don't like about Yuichi's reasoning here requires us to take a step back and look at the bigger picture. Consider the scenario that the characters are in. 5 people have been kidnapped and thrown into a series of games where they're told that they collectively have a debt of 20 million yen, which could become even larger if they don't play their cards right. I think it's completely understandable that the people in the game could be just a tiny bit on edge, perhaps, and their tempers could run a little bit shorter. So 2 of these people getting into a fight doesn't really seem like that big of a stretch of the imagination if you ask me. As far as I'm concerned, the only reason Tenji isn't tested by Yuichi at all is because it's convenient for the story to be that way. With all of that said and done, let's now turn our attention a little and ask a question. Am I being too unreasonable with the traps and the sequence of events surrounding it? Not every plan needs to be airtight, waterproof, seamless, and other similar adjectives in order for it to work. Sometimes you need to gamble, flip that coin, roll that dice, take that 50-50, and hope that it works out in your favor for that step of the plan to work out. From that angle, a lot of the things that I've criticized about Yuichi's grand schemes in Game 2 could be written off as just that, a series of gambles Yuichi took. However, I find this approach to be almost impossible to buy into, and this is all because of how the anime presents the explanation of his plan. This is now when we finally get to talk about the real culprits behind all of this, the admins. I hate these characters. For all the shit that I've given Yuichi in this video, he doesn't even compare to the admins. The reason why the admins are responsible for this is because they're the ones that illustrate Yuichi's plan to be airtight, waterproof, seamless, and other similar adjectives. These people absolutely adore him and can't stop talking about how impressed they are by the things he does. Anytime he breathes, blinks, or even just exists, the admins are going off about how that move was so calculated and that he has everybody in the palm of his hands and that he's such an evil mastermind. Let's gather some examples of this just to try and hammer this point home because it really is that annoying and unbearable. Obviously, translations are going to be different depending on who you got your subtitles from as well as for the dub too, but hopefully the context should remain the same. Episode 6 is the peak of their adoration as Yuichi starts explaining everything he did in Game 2. The black-haired admin lady is truly the worst of the 3 since she's the one that engages in this behavior the most and the other 2 don't even come close. It also doesn't help that the pink and blonde admins don't seem to be that sharp, meaning that the black-haired admin does a lot of the explaining to them while buttering up Yuichi. Really, she's like the Yuichi light of the admins, which is truly a terrifying thought. Right after Yuichi reveals that he had everybody else give him their name tags, she reacts with, and I quote, "Only a very devious mind can prey on the weakness of others like that. He knows all about human weakness and about the power and terror of money. His thought process is similar to the way that religious cults and pyramid schemes operate." Which is then followed with, "The fact that they're still smiling after handing over their name tags, which are the lifeblood of this game, is absolutely chilling. This expert liar who tricked the others and still left them smiling. Who..." Oh, my lord. Who is this man, really? In episode 2, right after the group clears gate 1, she goes, "With wit and courage like that, he doesn't seem like an ordinary high schooler," while forgetting about the fact that 5 minutes ago Yuichi just asked the class about Shio's underwear. Then there's a wild collection of lines that are in regards to how Yuichi is the most evil monster of all time. Episode 3 has, "In other words, Katagiri Yuichi is aware that he is impure." This one is kind of spoilers for Game 3, but we're gonna get to it anyway, so. Episode 8. "Katagiri Yuichi is even more of a crazy asshole than I thought." And Episode 7. "I doubt very much that even a genius could kill a monster." Fuck. With the monster in question being Yuichi, of course. My favorite set of lines from all of this comes from the admins trying to paint Yuichi in increasingly evil ways, which starts with Episode 5 with, "We may have let a human abomination play this game," followed by Episode 6 with, "He isn't just a human abomination, he's an absolute monster," which is all capped off with Episode 11 when one admin goes, "Katagiri Yuichi, he's a devil," and another one responds with, "Yes, he probably brings misery to everyone he touches," which is completely true, by the way, because I was fucking miserable watching the anime by that point. The visual side of the presentation doesn't do the anime any favors either, with shots like this, that, these 2, these 3, this one, and 5 more to top it off. The main objective is to really push Yuichi's image over the edge by, well, looking edgy. Now, I'll admit that pulling in quotes from episodes that take place after Game 2 to poke holes in Game 2 isn't really fair, but I think it's important to recognize that a lot of what I've spoken about in this video is from the perspective of my second time through with the anime. Game 3 is what really pushed it over the edge for me in terms of how unbearable things were getting, And because I had advanced knowledge of how the anime would be treating Yuichi, it just brought an even closer eye of criticism to the character on my second time through Game 2. As far as Tomodachi game is concerned, Yuichi can do no wrong. He's 20 steps ahead of everybody. He reads people like books and sees through them like glass. His alphabet only has 25 letters because he can't take an L. While this deification of Katagiri Yuichi gets exponentially worse with Game 3, Game 2 is where it starts to ramp up. And it's hilariously insufferable watching the anime be absolutely terrified of this character as it casually glosses over the various holes in his schemes. And that's it for the core of Game 2, that is. There's still a bunch of miscellaneous things about Game 2 to get through that aren't directly related to the traps, and we'll begin by getting through a few more notes about a couple characters that aren't Yuichi. On my second time through, something about everything being seen through Tenji's point of view is ironically funny to me because of the pretentious evil man bit he's playing. The benefit of hindsight makes it really goofy since it's revealed that all of his attempts at manipulation were completely pointless, and that he was being played like a fiddle. He also really does take every single opportunity to narrate every single thought he's having, which only makes the bit even funnier to me. And at the very end, when Yuichi hasn't backed into a corner without having Ace attorneyed him yet, Tenji inner monologues about how Yuichi's plan is so gosh darn waterproof and that he's just going to reveal himself as the traitor before proceeding to cry about it. But really, what does that even do to change anything? Tenji's goal was to send Shiho into the third game by herself, and him crying about it does nothing to change the fact that he's failed. I don't know why it's presented as this grand final plan for Tenji to go out with a bang when it does nothing. He said something like, Yuichi is so dense that he'll listen to me, and even if he is so dense, it still changes nothing. I guess the goal could be to maybe earn some pity points, so people will hate him less, but nobody at the end even seems that mad anyways, so that line of thought just doesn't hold much water. Jumping over to Shibe for a second, he somehow has a less aggressive/emotional response to finding out that Yuichi killed 3 people in the past, compared to discovering that Shiho likes Yuichi and that she dated Tenji in the past. At the same time, Tenji decides to be very mean to Shibe here, and this time I'm actually kind of okay with Shibe trying to start a fight. Tenji's comments here are deeply personal, way more personal than just calling him an idiot like he did earlier, and it touches upon a clearly sensitive topic for Shibe. Given the context of the events that happened prior to the start of these 2 attempted fights, these 2 fights really shouldn't be treated as equals, but they are. If Shibe was described as some sort of hot-headed or impulsive personality, then I don't think these fights would bother me so much, but he's not, so I'm going to continue being bothered by them. And speaking of Shibe, why are any of the people in this group even friends with this guy? Like, I know earlier I talked a whole lot about how none of these characters feel like friends because the anime doesn't fucking take the time to set up these people as being friends, but I genuinely don't understand why these people like Shibe. His entire presence in the anime amounts to either being made fun of or saying stupid, insensitive shit. The way the anime portrays these stupid, insensitive things he said is weird too. He makes light of the girl who was pressured into compensated dating, and the anime doesn't sweat it because he was just trying to make her feel better in the least helpful way possible, but him getting turned off by the idea of Shio having gotten plastic surgery becomes a critical component to his character in Game 2. Part of me feels kinda bad for this guy for being the butt of every joke, but nobody in the anime genuinely seems to like this guy with the way they treat him. In round 7, there is one card submitted, which claims that Shibe has killed somebody. Shibe is obviously very unhappy to hear this news, and profusely claims that this is a lie. Banabu tells him to prove it, and Shibe can't, so that's the end of that. However, at the end of Game 2, Yuichi claims that this was a lie and that he's the one that actually killed people. The admins get to fact-checking this and discover that this is true, which causes Yuichi to be pushed all the way to the front and be the one to clear Game 2. At the same time, Tenji also says that he told a lie, which he manages to prove, and he also gets pushed to the front, causing him to clear Game 2 at the same time as Yuichi. The more I think about it, the more I realize that the rule about lies is dumb. The rule is that you can lie, but if your lie gets busted, you get sent to the very front. Seems simple enough. The 2 instances of a lie that are busted are when Yuichi says that Shibe didn't kill someone and when Tenji says that he never had feelings for Shiho. In both instances, the person who wrote the lie had to come out and say that they lied. If they didn't say anything, then these lies would have never been exposed. So the rule doesn't matter then, because the game and the admins have no method of proactively detecting lies since they don't care about what's being written until somebody explicitly claims that they wrote a lie. So by this logic, every single thing that was written on these cards could be a lie, and people just didn't say anything about them, so the admins never bothered checking them. If one is to play devil's advocate in this regard, you could say that perhaps this exists so the players can suspect each other for lies in order to foster more distrust. But the anime doesn't actually do that at all unless the lie is explicitly thrown into somebody's face, so that argument doesn't get anywhere. If Game 2 had a way to see every single card that was being submitted and fact-check each and every one of these to ensure they were all true, then that might add a layer of tension to the game because everybody is forced to be honest if they don't want to suffer the consequences. See, Yuichi's last little plan for Game 2 is actually the first time any of this shit he said seems logical, but unfortunately the whole rule about lying comes back to bite him in the ass. To be fair, there are some of these cards that can't really be factually proven because how can a computer prove a feeling? But the admins should be able to find out who signed the group up for the Tomodachi game with very little issue. So if everybody writes down, "I signed us up" on their papers, then the liar should be able to be busted. But again, the admins don't proactively check for lies, so unless the trader actively declares, "I didn't lie on my paper," then they wouldn't prompt an investigation because they're fucking lazy. When Yuichi says that he lied, the admins are very enthusiastic about fact-checking it. When Tenji says that he lied, the admins can't fact-check it because how would their computer know about his feelings? But when Shibei says that the note about Shibei having killed a person is a lie, the admins don't care and don't bother checking him like they did with Yuichi. Can you prove that this is a lie? The anime goes out of the way to happily prove Yuichi's lie for him, and I'm willing to let Tenji's lie get away with it. But why is the onus on Shibei to prove his? Yuichi didn't have to prove his own lie. If records of it might exist, then the admins should check either everything or nothing, not playing favorites. Perhaps Shibei's rich and scummy dad, who got exposed earlier by the admins for doing suspicious things, did the rich and scummy thing by throwing some money around to silence the right people so that Shibei's supposed murder stays hidden forever. Except that the admins are somehow able to dig up all these rich and scummy things that Shibei's dad has been doing in the background that have been hidden all this time, so even if this alleged murder was buried under a pile of bribes, they should still be able to dig it back up. But no, the anime doesn't want to fact check him here because why should it? Also, I really hope that this is a horrible mistranslation or something, but who the fuck reads a note that says Shibei killed a person and reacts to it with, "That's cringe"? Much like many of the other minor complaints, this one is also irrelevant, but once again, when presented with a situation with an ocean of good responses, the anime somehow manages to choose the wrong one. The ending to episode 6 is one of the worst things I've ever seen. They could have turned any of Tenji's cards into a lie. It could have been anything else. They could have said that Tenji lying about his age is actually a lie and that he's the same age as everybody else and that he just made it up to manipulate the game in a certain way. It could have just been anything else, but the way that the anime decides to prove that Tenji doesn't have feelings for Shio is by having him give Yuichi a big kiss on the lips as they fall into the pit of hell. I have no idea why the anime decides that he should go from being Tomodachi to Homodachi for 30 seconds just to get him into the third game. If they really wanted to be cute and clever, then they could have just said that in the last few rounds. Yuichi had been manipulating the lies in other people to write specific things to push both him and the traitor into the third game simultaneously that doesn't involve anybody coming out of any closets. It would even be in line with the anime's Church of Utmost Yuichi worship because he would have gotten the credit for everything. The ending of the episode is supposed to be all dark and brooding, with Yuichi saying friends are dumb and that he's now going to be free of his limiters and that the admins are going to be taken down and etc. etc. This little bit of tender loving really does a number on the mood the anime is trying to work with, and even as someone who isn't invested in the scene and watching it with heaps of skepticism, you really have to think about how the anime couldn't even take itself seriously enough to respect the atmosphere it's trying to establish. As a farewell to Game 2, I'd just like to point out that each person is required to take 3 minutes in the booth and all 5 people need to go every turn. So that's a minimum of 15 minutes, and then let's just add an extra 5 minutes to take into account for bits of downtime between people leaving and entering the box, Manabu checking the box to read the cards, the voting by the survey, and whatever else. This makes for a minimum of 20 minutes per round. So if that's 3 rounds per hour at a fairly efficient rate and the game took 19 rounds to clear, I figure it would probably take them at least 6 or 7 hours to complete this whole game, which is fucking wild to think about. Game 1 probably took a maximum of 20 minutes because each turn doesn't take a whole lot of time. And also, the scar on Tenji's face being very neatly covered up by his glasses is pretty silly for how convenient it is. It doesn't matter, but irrelevant things can be silly too. After Game 2 ends, there's a bit of an interlude between it and Game 3 where Yuichi and Tenji chill in the darkest pit of hell for 72 hours as they talk over some things. The lore is that back in the day, Tenji had 2 other friends and 1,000,000 yen. They decided to invest this into trying to grow a business. At some point, Shiho enters the picture and Tenji's 2 other friends end up liking her. They start to lose money for some reason, which they're able to get back on track. When the 1,000,000 becomes 3,000,000, they play a game where the 3 friends each take 1,000,000 and invest it individually, and whoever profited the most by the time the total reaches 20,000,000 gets to become the CEO of their new company and get the right to propose to Shiho because I'm sure she agreed to that. Then the 3 of them are set into a Tomodachi game, which results in them losing and Tenji getting pushed with 20,000,000 yen's worth of debt. Tenji then confronts one of his friends about the money, and all they say is that they used it all for Shiho. Shiho is then framed to be creepy in shots that aren't important, before Tenji tells the story to his dad. Tenji's dad is later found dead and his death is ruled a suicide. Tenji signed up the whole group for a Tomodachi game in order to try and corner Shiho and get the truth from her. The backstory is just okay, but it feels like the story is just jumping to conclusions. To me, this story sounds more like Tenji's friends were being irresponsible with their money and emotions rather than Shiho being responsible for anything. I mean, yes, from a literal reading of this story, the money was spent on Shiho and the anime frames her in a really sus way, but the way the anime presents Tenji's friends makes them seem like pretty irresponsible guys, especially when they talk about whoever makes the most money gets to marry Shiho. I think the thing that really bothers me the most about this story is that Tenji is talking all about how Shiho is fucked up and she fucked up everything, but the way the story presents her actions doesn't line up with this at all. In the flashback, she's just a little creepy, and throughout the games, she acted fairly normally. It just feels like the anime is trying to hype up an ordinary, boring character as this massive villain, and it doesn't really go anywhere. Another thing that always struck me as extremely weird is the shift in Tenji's motivations that occur as he goes from Game 2 to Game 3. In Game 2, it quite clearly paints Tenji's motivations as this obsessive need to control Shiho as a result of him having feelings for her. But in Game 3, this gets reorganized to Tenji using the Tomodachi game as a method to try and investigate Shiho's connections to the game. Technically speaking, there is a connection between the 2 motivations across the game, since you could say that the reason he feels the obsessive need to control Shiho is because of his goal of investigating her. But the way the anime frames any mention of Shiho's motivations in these 2 games are so wildly different from one another, with Game 2 having a very uncomfortable sexual tone to it, while any discussion of it in Game 3 paints Shiho out to be this accomplice to some grand conspiracy theory. A lot of Tenji's actions in Game 2 only really make sense if the motivations stated during Game 2 are completely true. While some of the wording throughout Game 2 is vague enough that his later revealed motivations can somewhat fit into it, Game 2's motivations are largely based around Tenji wanting to maintain control with some uncomfortable sexual notes thrown in there. Meanwhile, if Tenji's true intentions were to try and expose Shiho for who she really is, then almost everything in Game 2 that Tenji did basically doesn't matter. All the gaslighting and isolating he tries to put her through would have made some sense if it was left in the context that Game 2 presents it under, but none of this behavior would realistically do anything to cause Shiho to reveal her true self to anybody. If anything, this kind of behavior encourages her to interact with people even less because Tenji keeps telling her off every time she interacts with anybody, so it should foster a more sheltered, quiet personality out of Shiho. This could pretty easily be solved by having Tenji write a note that says Shiho is not involved with the Tomodachi game in any way, shape, or form, then declaring that it's a lie in order to force an investigation. And lastly, of all the things that Tenji decides to feel bad about, it's the fact that he eavesdropped on Shiho and Yuichi after Game 1. After doing things like bugging someone's bag to listen in on their conversations and following someone all the way home without their knowledge, simply eavesdropping on someone seems like it should present no moral quandaries. Now that we've made it this far into the video, let's address the thumbnail. There are 4 keywords on it: pretentious, overcomplicated, oversimplified, and disrespectful. I think I've already made a case for pretentious when going over all the various Yuichi-related quotes, so I won't repeat myself here. Overcomplicated, oversimplified, and disrespectful are going to be the main recurring traits for Game 3. This is the point where everything we love about Tomodachi game grows exponentially and comes back with a vengeance. Yuichi's plans falling into his own lap rather than him actually working for them, the anime's unending fear and love for Yuichi, the characters being convenient tools for the story rather than actually interesting characters, the flashbacks, and even the sexism. For better or for worse, this is where the anime peaks. Game 3 is Friendly Hide and Seek. There are two teams present in this game, Tenji and Yuichi, who will now be referred to collectively as Group C, and a group of 5 brand new characters known as Group K. One person on your team is a hider and everybody else is a seeker. You're given some time at the beginning of the game to find a suitable location to hide your hider. This person must remain in this one location and they aren't allowed to leave that area. Leaving that area will cause your team to lose the game. Hiders are also given a give up button, which if they press, will instantly forfeit the game for the whole group. Seekers cannot move their hiders, nor can they be violent towards the opposing team. They can, however, contact other players, including ones on the opposing team, via phones provided to them by the game. Food and water is available at the center of the arena. It is the seeker's responsibility to deliver supplies to their respective hider. Anybody minus the hider can switch teams, the only requirement being that they must request it at the center of the arena and at least one person on the opposing team must accept. And of course, if a seeker finds the opposing team's hider, then they win the game. Whoever is on the winning team at the time of the game being cleared will have all of their debt transferred over to the opposing team. Breaking any of the rules at any time causes your team's debt to double and instantly forces a loss. While games 1 and 2 put their fair share of focus onto other characters, Game 3 is all about Yuichi. One of my least favorite things about Game 3 in regards to Yuichi is how the anime tries to present him as a twisted mastermind who will cook up all sorts of fucked up plans in order to secure the win in one way or another. Yet the anime cannot resist carefully explaining each and every step along the way, sometimes even multiple times to the viewer. One of the avenues in which tension and even potential fear can arise from watching a twisted individual stems from not being able to understand or relate to why the person thinks the way they do. It's unpredictable, perhaps even illogical to the average person. But when you take almost every opportunity you can to explain the thought process behind every single supposedly fucked up thing that's about to happen or has happened, these scenes just completely lose their weight. If the explanation was done in some sort of distorted or twisted manner, that could alleviate this issue, but the anime doesn't do that either because Yuichi's plans are almost always drawn out in the most coherent and pandering ways possible by the admins. Meanwhile, Yuichi is wearing that big sadistic grin on his face with big wide open eyes, which just makes these explanations feel even sillier, as if the anime can't quite grasp how badly it's destroying its own sense of suspense. It's in this weird limbo state where it thinks it's being so overcomplicated that it feels the need to oversimplify things. And sometimes it is overcomplicated. I don't think you need to look much further than the rule sets for games 2 and 3 to see how the anime has tried to structure itself into being overcomplicated. But outside of the times when the anime is being unreasonably obscure, the anime doesn't seem to have any faith in the viewer to keep up with everything that's happening, so things need to be repeatedly and thoughtfully explained to the viewer after it happens. Episode 9 is the best example of this, where Yuichi is trying to annoy Group K, but it cuts to a flashback of him explaining this exact plan to Maria as it's happening, before it cuts back to real time where he annoys them a little more, before it cuts back again to the flashback where Yuichi continues to explain the same thing. As an aside, one could also say that watching a twisted individual could be tense or scary if any of their motivations or actions suddenly end up being relatable, so there could be an eerie bit of resonance between you and the character. However, this one doesn't really apply to Tomodachi game because, let's be real, there's never going to be a circumstance in which you'll need to think like you're in a Tomodachi game, so nothing Yuichi says or does is ever going to be super relatable. At the same time, there's a lot of things that happen in Game 3, but Yuichi does not put a meaningful amount of effort into making them happen. In fact, the most critical part of Yuichi's plan only happens because of an intensely specific sequence of events that somebody else accidentally does for him. Yet everything is presented as if Yuichi had his entire plan laid out from the very beginning of the game, and every single thing that occurs throughout the game was an outcome manipulated by him. And don't forget that he's still a monster, or abomination, or devil, or other scary things that the anime thinks he is. Yuichi's plan begins when Manabu tells Group C that they have the option of adding a third person to the group, a girl named Maria from another group who only made it to Game 3 on her own. After asking if she's a girl, Yuichi quickly accepts this deal without discussing it with Tenji. After Tenji offers to be the hider, Yuichi tucks him away into the back of a cave. Yuichi does not return to this cave for several days. During this time, he and Maria are at the center of the arena where all the food and water is, seemingly not doing a whole lot while secretly psychoanalyzing everybody in that area. One day, Yuichi and Maria decide to run off, where Yuichi uses Maria as a distraction to stop Group K from chasing him. He returns with supplies to a deprived Tenji and informs Tenji that he's got a plan to secure the win and that the reason he left Tenji to starve and dehydrate for several days was to test his trust. Yuichi leaves and returns back to the center, where he aggravates Hyakutaro of Group K enough to have him join Group C. Everything after this point gets a little messy to describe, but the most concise way to put it is that Yuichi ties up Hyakutaro to a tree before finding out that he has to keep a watch of him at all times, because leaving Hyakutaro alone could lose Yuichi the game. Maria eventually betrays Yuichi and gives Tenji's location away to Group K, and after all hope seems lost, Manabu announces that Group C has won the game. A flashback reveals that Yuichi managed to coerce Group K's hider into pressing the give-up grenade. I think it's important to recognize that the game occurs in 3 clear phases. The first phase involves Yuichi leaving Tenji in a cave all by himself for several days. The second phase involves Yuichi spending a lot of time together with people from Group K. The third phase involves the anime explaining how Group C wins Game 3. The largest of these 3 phases is pretty easily the second one, so let's start with that. A large component of Yuichi's plan involves understanding the relationships within Group K and then destroying these relationships. During the time he spends bumming around at the center of the arena with 4 members of Group K, he supposedly gets a grasp of everybody's character. And I can only say supposedly because we can only take Yuichi's word for it. The anime doesn't really go out of its way to show Yuichi learning much about anybody except for one scene we'll get into in a minute. There's not much shown in terms of substantial character interaction between members of Group K either, since a lot of them consist of basic personality traits that don't go much deeper than advertised. They even come packaged with the same quick paragraphs that we love so much. Hyakutaro is perhaps the one exception here, but it's also a little unfair to everybody else, since he gets a lot more screen time compared to the rest of the gang. The anime likes to talk about how Yuichi psychoanalyzed the entirety of Group K while showing very little of it happening, so Yuichi could have spit out any number of adjectives about these characters, and we just kinda have to go along with it. So how does Yuichi determine that Hyakutaro is the perfect person to manipulate? Hyakutaro is very reminiscent of Shibe in that they're both not the sharpest tools in the shed, and the group they belong to are aware of this fact, but at least Hyakutaro isn't subject to ceaseless humiliation by his so-called friends. During the morning of the day of Yuichi's escape, he and Hyakutaro get to talking, where Hyakutaro's selective goldfish memory comes into play. The night before, Yuichi was trying to bait Hyakutaro into hitting him by making fun of Group K's reliance upon their captain for making decisions. So when morning comes and suddenly Yuichi is buttering up the captain for no apparent reason, should this not immediately draw at least a little bit of suspicion? But Hyakutaro forgives any and all, since he starts being friendly with Yuichi in no time. And while most of the beans Hyakutaro spills here are unimportant, this is what cinches it for Yuichi, and his crosshairs are now firmly pointed. This is the only scene that I can consider to be a concerted effort on the anime's part to display Yuichi actually trying to understand the people he's around. Everything else he explains to Tenji about Group K is simply pulled out of thin air. His analysis of Chisato is the best example of this, where Yuichi has 0 meaningful interactions with this character, yet can perfectly deduce not only his personality as a whole, but a critical character flaw that Yuichi plans on targeting as well. At least for Hyakutaro, there was some evidence on screen, but this one is actually just the anime making it up on the spot. This also hurts Group K in the long run too, because with Yuichi laying out his observations at the end of episode 9, the anime effectively declares the end of character progression for Group K and really the end of putting effort into these characters. There is still the twist that Little Red K is the group's genius, and while I'm sure some people were blown away by this reveal, this was somehow the least impactful twist that I never expected. I don't know what it is about this reveal, but it somehow managed to leave no impression on me whatsoever. Also, K is the genius behind Group K, which... very funny. The most obvious and least elegant solution to this issue would be to show Yuichi having a scene with every member of Group K like he did with Hyakutaro over the course of the 2 days he spends chilling with them, but the problem with this is that somehow this would be even more boring than what's been happening this entire time. Nobody in Group K has a particularly deep or layered personality, and Yuichi having shifted his personality into a full-time smug and evil god makes him outrageously intolerable. One scene was manageable, but 4 would be 3 too many. Really, the anime is kind of fucked no matter how you slice it, because it's boring and convenient in its current state, but it would be boring and tedious in the other way. Perhaps a more elegant and complex solution would be to better outline the time Yuichi spent with these people through interactions between the Group K members. This would give the viewer the opportunity to understand these relationships at the same time as Yuichi, so the conclusions that Yuichi will eventually come to feel more like a natural, sensible reveal compared to what it is currently. Really, that feeling extends out to the rest of Game 3 and even Game 2 as well. The anime presents things from an intentionally strangled perspective that allows Yuichi to see things that the viewer can't. And it's not just tiny, imperceptible details that were there the entire time that you only notice once you're made aware of. It's quite literally stuff that's never shown on the screen that Yuichi is given VIP access to, and his plans are always relying very heavily on this material. Earlier in the video, I mentioned that there was a secret third main problem with Tomodachi game that I'd unveil when the time is right. Well, the time is now, and this third main problem is an intentional obfuscation of important information. We already saw this in action with Game 2, where what Yuichi sees and does with his third traps isn't the same thing that we're being shown. Even if the viewer wants to come to their own conclusions on anything, you're never going to be as informed on the matter as Yuichi is, and ultimately it's only his perspective that matters for everything. This is what I mean by disrespectful. The viewer isn't afforded the same opportunities as Yuichi, so even if they want to follow along and keep up with everything to see the process of puzzling together a winning formula, they're inevitably going to be bombarded with new information that only Yuichi is given. Whatever the viewer thinks doesn't matter, because Yuichi's wild ride will go in whichever direction it wants. Let's address what I said earlier. The most critical part of Yuichi's plan only happens because of an intensely specific sequence of events that somebody else accidentally does for him. In order for Yuichi to be able to make his escape, he has to catch his watchers off guard in order to get a head start. This involves getting Hyakutaro, the one guy who would be the most flustered upon discovering an undressed Maria, actually running into an undressed Maria, then being so flustered that he runs all the way back to the center of the arena. Hyakutaro needs to go to a very specific location at a very specific timing by complete chance and also have a very specific reaction in order for Yuichi's plans to work out. Imagine if any of this goes just a tiny bit awry. Maybe instead of looking for Maria, Hyakutaro runs back and reports to Chisato that she's missing. Maybe when he blindly goes looking for her, he goes in the wrong direction and doesn't bump into Maria. Maybe he takes a janky path that takes him a while to get through, so by the time he gets to Maria, she's fully dressed again unless Yuichi instructed her to be standing in the woods undressed and just stand there indefinitely until Hyakutaro finds her. Maybe when Hyakutaro bumps into an undressed Maria, he doesn't panic and run all the way back to the center in front of Yuichi, but instead runs back far enough that he can't see Maria while still out of line of sight from the center. A lot of things need to line up awfully perfectly here in order to make this all happen, doesn't it? And this one can't even be excused as Yuichi having a perfect read on Hyakutaro's character because there's stuff in this sequence that doesn't involve people's personalities at all and is just straight up randomness. I also think it's kind of hilarious to imagine a world in which Yuichi and Maria have been trying to set this sequence of events up for several days, and this is like their third or fourth attempt to make it work. Moving on to a few more points in regards to Yuichi bad, in episode 9, Yuichi is finally able to get back to Tenji right as Tenji is about to either pass out or straight up die. Once he's been fed, Tenji calls Yuichi an idiot before questioning him about what he would have done if Tenji did press the give up grenade while Yuichi was gone. And Yuichi's response to this is, "You didn't press it though." So Yuichi is apparently smart enough that once he learns that the third person joining his group is a girl, he's able to put together an entire scheme on winning Game 3 instantly that relies heavily upon the new person being a girl. Yet, somehow, someway, this kid did not think of a contingency plan to back his ass up if Tenji pressed the button, and his entire plan was balanced on top of the needle that is depriving the shit out of Tenji, and gambling on the fact that he won't press the button that loses them the entire game. Of all the crimes that this anime commits, this is by far the most egregious one to me because of how Game 3 just does all this nonsense to put Yuichi up on the tallest goddamn possible pedestal, yet just completely glances over this extremely critical hole in the plan. The entirety of Game 3 is just shit falling into place because Yuichi demands it, and the anime isn't subtle about it at all. Gambling on Tenji not pressing the button with no backup plan whatsoever is by far the biggest example of this. I don't care if he perfectly psychoanalyzed Tenji by listening to the sounds of him hallucinating from 10 miles away. Yuichi can calculate everything to such a T that he can predict every single one of Hyakutaro's movements and reactions when Hyakutaro wanders off into the woods to check on Maria, but he has nothing. He has backup plans for when Hyakutaro doesn't hit him, when Yuichi isn't allowed to switch teams, and when Maria betrays him, but he has nothing for this. And the reason he has nothing for this is because there is no backup plan to straight up losing the game. Maybe this wouldn't be so aggravating if Yuichi acknowledged the gamble he took at any point before his return to Tenji, but he doesn't even break a sweat. He's given the option to give up to a guy who's going to be dehydrated for 3 or 4 days and starved for almost a week. Even when he does respond, Yuichi doesn't say anything like, "I was so worried," or "this gamble was absolutely necessary." All he has to say in response to Tenji pointing this fact out is basically, "Well, I'm glad you didn't, so let's move on." The anime likes to think of itself as being so cunning and smart, but when it writes itself into a corner like this, it just skips right over the gaping hole that everybody can see and pretends it's not there. The cliffhanger at the end of episode 10 is possibly the least subtle single moment in the entire anime. The anime, by this point, has kind of lost all credibility with giving Yuichi any flaws because he can do no wrong, with the man constantly pulling new steps of his plan out of his ass whenever it's convenient, so obviously the following episode is going to start with how Group C actually won because of this epic wicked smart thing Yuichi did behind the scenes. There's something about how episode 11 reveals that Yuichi pounding his fists and swearing in despair was just a complete act that is unreasonable. Maybe this is what the power of hindsight does to somebody, but I genuinely can't stand it. The fact that this acting was also planned is what infuriates me. Everything was so meticulously pre-planned from the start that when Yuichi keeps revealing over and over that everything is just part of his plan, you can't take any of these plot twists and reveals seriously because it's just going to be followed up by the anime sucking off Yuichi about how he thought of this the entire time. The anime just can't give this character even the briefest moment of weakness. So I can understand Hyakutaro not knowing who has the debt because people don't tell Hyakutaro shit like where the captain is hiding, so it's not a far cry to believe that they didn't tell him that the captain has the debt too. But why would anybody on Group K tell Yuichi about who had the debt even if they did know about it? They strictly have no reason to mingle with Yuichi on such a personal level when they're on opposing, competing teams. So not only does Yuichi just eliminate 3 of Group K from the possibility just because they claimed that they knew nothing about it, but then he just says that it's the captain who has it because he realized the power dynamic went the other way, as if that means anything. Yuichi is never seen directly interacting with Kei in any meaningful... Oh god, this anime is killing me. Yuichi is never seen directly interacting with Kei in any meaningful capacity, and he hasn't seen the captain in person since the very beginning of Game 3, but he's able to figure out that the power dynamic went the other way without watching them interact a single time. For all he knows, both Kei and the captain could have been geniuses on equal terms, and they were perfectly collaborating with one another instead of Kei being the one and only person calling the shots. For all he knows, Kei sending back Hyakutaro while on the way to the captain's location could have been genuine rather than a ploy by Kei. I unironically would have respected the anime more if it just said that Yuichi took a shot in the dark and pinned the debt onto the captain for no reason other than trying his luck, but knowing myself, I would bitch and whine about it anyways. Perhaps Katagiri Yuichi is a true supporter of gender equality given that he's equally merciless in the way he uses both males and females like tools. I think this line is very silly. Yeah, sure, Yuichi is using people like tools, but there must have been a better way to talk about it if the anime wants to rub it in your face. Like, I'm sorry, but this true supporter of gender equality line is so dumb. It reminds me a lot of the Shiho's panties lines from episode 1, which was also really dumb, but with how the anime feels like it's reaching for these sporadic moments of random XD humor in the middle of a completely serious scene, which not only takes the weight out of that scene, but just isn't funny either. I get the feeling that this isn't supposed to be funny though, so I'm really not sure what it's supposed to be besides being very silly. That's enough Yuichi slander for now, so let's move on to some other characters. Thankfully, just like Yuichi, I too am a true supporter of gender equality, so it's time to talk about why Maria is bad. There's really nothing new to fault in terms of Maria as a character because it's mostly the same criticisms I've aired about other side characters about her just not having a particularly deep or interesting personality. I should point out that she does have 2 different personalities depending on which game she's present in. In games 1 and 2, she's kind of an airhead who can't really keep up with everything that's going on and needs to have a lot of things explained to her by the black-haired admin. In game 3, she has a bit more of a devious personality where she gets some amount of morbid enjoyment from watching Yuichi be an asshole to everybody. While this should contradict a note about her not having a deep or interesting personality, it's more like she's 2 entirely separate characters rather than her having a multifaceted personality, because these 2 sides of Maria never overlap. They're entirely split apart at all times, so I can't really count this as a depth to personality. However, the issue with Maria isn't who she is, but rather what she is in terms of the story. In essence, she's a band-aid fix designed to cover up a lot of the holes in Game 3 that seems to result from the decision of only having 2 people from Group C move onwards. Having 3 people is basically the minimum number of people required for a team in order for Game 3 to be even playable. The anime recognizes this too, which is why it tosses Maria into the fray. If Game 3 is so hard to clear both alone and with 2 people to such a point that they offer a 3rd person to join your group, couldn't Game 2 have been written so that the first 2 people or groups of people who reach the end are pushed into Game 3, or whoever is in second place at the time of the game being cleared is pushed into Game 3? Game 3 is straight up impossible with just 1 person because they're forced to be the hider so they can't move to seek or get any supplies. Yes, the entirety of the Tomodachi game is all about testing the limits of your friendships, and if somebody got pushed to the end of Game 2 by themselves, then something must have gone horribly awry with the friendship dynamics of that group, and this lone person is now being punished for it by being forced to play Game 3 by themselves. In Game 2, Yuichi makes a big fuss about how the game isn't fair because all of the squares that they've been landing on have been piling on more debt. He deduces that the back half of the board must be loaded with squares that alleviate your debt, and he's correct with confirmation from the admins as well. So if the anime is going to make a big deal about how Game 2 is supposed to be fair, despite it seeming unfair at the start, then Game 3 should ultimately also have a minimum degree of fairness to it by at least making it playable for both teams. It would also mean that there would have been a method to circumvent the awful ending to Game 2 by having Tenji push himself to the finish point with Shiho in second place so that he can take her with him to Game 3, but then Yuichi does his switcheroo and instead pushes him and Tenji into Game 3. For anybody that wants to say something like, but that would require a much more significant rewriting of Game 2 in order to ensure that Tenji is in first place, it actually wouldn't, because the anime skips 11 rounds worth of the game anyways. It goes straight from round 8 to round 19, and there's no way to know what happens during that time. This did make me wonder if the manga actually covers all of the skipped rounds or not, but not curious enough to actually go read the manga. Even if we disregard that, the entire purpose of the Tomodachi game is to test the limits of your friendship. Then why do they give Group C a 3rd person who is a complete stranger to the group? If the goal is to see how a friendship is tested by the addition of a stranger to the dynamic and perhaps test how the pre-existing dynamic incorporates or isolates this stranger, then all participating groups should get a stranger thrown into them. From a story perspective, Maria is clearly thrown in there to keep a closer eye on Yuichi to see what demonic, devilish, and demonically devilish things he will do. But from a perspective of the game, the addition of Maria does nothing to facilitate more interesting things in the game, unless the goal is supposed to be to see how inserting a woman into a game with nothing but men in it impacts the dynamics within, but that seems like a rather sexist approach that treats this character like nothing but an object, which is exactly what the anime does, so I guess that's par for the course. I don't know what it is, but there's something about one of the admins joining the game in person and just doing everything that one of the players is telling them to do that doesn't sit well with me. From a pure fairness point of view, the admins should purely be observers and nothing else. They shouldn't be directly influencing the results of the game, which is exactly what Maria is doing here. Really, the more and more I think about it, the less and less I enjoy the direct addition of Maria into the game because she simply is a band-aid fix applied to Game 3 after the story realizes that there is zero chance for Group C to win. And also, Maria can't be trusted enough to know the location of Tenji's hiding spot, but it's completely fine for Yuichi to tell her like 90% of his plans. Alright then. Moving away from Maria, here's 2 more minor complaints about Group K. I can't believe that after K is revealed to be the one who signed everybody up for the Tomodachi game and also berated the rest of the group to their faces, the rest of Group K just writes it off him as being a silly kid and they're back to being real good friends again. It doesn't really matter, but this would be a complete fucking deal breaker if it was me. I can't believe this kid has the audacity to act like such a brat after he put everybody up to this, presumably without their consent, because half of the group didn't even know about any debt, but I also can't believe the rest of the group is just willing to forgive and forget despite this nonsense. And here's something that has bothered me an unreasonable amount. Why does the blue-haired guy even exist? Group K could have operated their plans as necessary without him anyways. Only one person needed to run the supplies each time, with 2 people back at camp, and only one person needed to be there to watch Group C when they had Hyakutaro tied up, since Yuichi couldn't move and Maria doesn't know where Tenji is at the time anyways. This character seems to serve actually zero purpose for the story. All he does is make manga references and then spanks K at the end of Game 3, both of which could have been accomplished by any other member of Group K. But who knows, maybe in chapter 40,000 of the manga, this guy comes back as the secret son of the Tomodachi game CEO or something. In order to wrap things up for Game 3, let's rapid fire through a few miscellaneous nitpicks. Yuichi punching Hyakutaro makes him the devil, but him pushing Maria off of a cliff or letting Tenji be starved, dehydrated, and generally deprived for 3 to 4 days is completely fine according to the admins. I think that it's very funny that Tenji just offers himself up to be the hider without even discussing it with Yuichi. Just one more step of Yuichi's plans that falls into place without him needing to even lift a finger. I'm usually not the one to complain about fan service in animes. They put it in because it works and it's just part of how the industry operates in this day and age, but really, did we need a panty and bra shot of Maria as she was being pushed off of a cliff? You seriously couldn't think of a better place to put it? We just saw her undressed anyways, so do we need to double down on this fan service right away? And lastly, I have zero clue as to how Manabu saying a vague phrase such as vast forest is a hint towards the fact that you aren't intended to blindly search for the hider. The actual method is fine, but Group K's process of getting to this method is just pulling answers out of nothing. Similar to games 1 and 2, there's a bit of an intermission phase before we get into our final one. After winning Game 3, Yuichi and Tenji are let outside for a little while. They head to their school where they meet Kokorogi, who informs the pair about what happened to the 3 that didn't participate in Game 2. Manabu debriefs the 3 about their current debt and how they're going to be let outside for a bit. Kokorogi also reveals that Shiho hasn't been seen for a while when a couple classmates enter the classroom and let Tenji and Yuichi know about how Shibe is getting arrested for the supposed murder of his own father. When Kokorogi comes back to the pair and talks about how she wants to help, Yuichi pushes her away with some very mean words, but only because he cares. While the two are thinking up a storm at Yuichi's place, Tenji receives a phone call revealing that Kokorogi has been kidnapped and Yuichi must come save her. The main issue that I have with this is in regards to how the anime handles Shiho. In general, I think the anime handles this character very poorly since most of her relevant dialogue happens very early on. In Game 2, she more or less does everything Tenji and Yuichi tell her to, and I've already talked about how she's one of the characters in Game 2 that don't really think for themselves. But perhaps the worst bit of writing for her character happens here during Kokorogi's flashback, talking about Manabu debriefing the 3. When Manabu mentions the total debt of Group C, Shiho starts acting extremely suspiciously. The last time we saw her in Game 2, she mostly kept to herself according to Tenji, and didn't seem to really care too much about the money bouncing up and down after the first couple squares. But now she's just on edge, and trying to dismiss Manabu's words as a poison destroying their friendship when nobody else in the room said anything. I despise this sudden shift in character that just happens in post because we were simply told by Tenji that Shiho is sus after the last time we saw her. The next time we see her, she begins to act in the most painfully obvious ways to be sus because the story said she had to be. I think if the anime hinted at Shiho being sus by having her dad show up in both instances of the police being involved with the Tomodachi game, that would have been a much cleaner, slightly more muted way of pointing out something strange with that character. Instead, the anime just has to rub it in your face with a lot of exposition as well as completely changing the character's behavior in order to get the message across. I also completely forgot about this until now, but if you had 2 million yen that you gathered from your classmates for a big class trip, you deliver that directly to the staff member responsible for collecting it. At the time of writing this, 2 million yen equates to just a little under $15,000. You do not just stick $15,000 in a school locker and be surprised when it's gone the next time you check because, let's be real, school lockers aren't exactly the most secure location ever. Once it's been revealed that Shiho stuck the money in her locker in like episode 3 or 4, the money being stolen is just her fault for being irresponsible with storing it. In the flashback in episode 11, they also try to retcon this a little more by saying that Shiho is sus for asking to collect it in cash, which, to be fair, is kinda sus for an amount this large, but still, The retconning of Shiho as a character only solidifies the anime's poor handling of this character. I've also pointed out a few times by now that there's a level of sexism present in the anime, but haven't directly addressed it. This mostly amounts to a series of quotes that generalize all women under a single umbrella, and no, just because a woman says some of these doesn't not make it sexist. There's, when a woman really wants something, she'll play dirty to get it, as well as, women are sensible creatures. No matter how much they like someone, they can fall out of love in an instant, both pulled fresh from episode 4. Then from episode 10, there's, all women are capable of putting on an act to get what they want. Now, I'm pretty sure this one is supposed to be intentionally sexist as opposed to the other ones which might be accidentally sexist. It also doesn't help that none of the women in the anime are written well. I just went over that with Shiho and also talked about the admin some time ago, but Kokorogi doesn't fare much better either. There was that weird moment in episode 1 when the anime chose to use the word sexy to describe Kokorogi rather than an actual personality trait like they did with everybody else. Really, she just becomes a device for other characters to springboard their agendas off of rather than being an interesting character all on her own. In Game 1, she becomes a damsel in distress that Yuichi rescues, while in Game 2, she has her brief moment in the spotlight when her backstory is revealed before fading into the background as Tenji takes center stage. And things don't get much better for her here in the final game of Tomodachi game either. The fourth IRL Tomodachi game challenge parentheses gone wrong is the week win game. It consists of a total of 3 rounds. In each round, a punishment is presented. Within a limited time window, Kokorogi must choose whether she or Yuichi receives the punishment. If Kokorogi can't decide in time, it defaults to Yuichi. Whatever the punishment is, Yuichi receives it 3 times, whereas Kokorogi receives it once. After this game concludes, Yuichi then fires back with a game of his own called Rock, Paper, Fingers. Yuichi plays a game of rock, paper, scissors with Kokorogi's kidnapper. If the kidnapper wins, Yuichi gives him a whole bunch of money. If they tie, then nothing happens. If the kidnapper loses, then Yuichi cuts off the kidnapper's fingers based on what hand the kidnapper played. 0 for rock, 2 for scissors, and 5 for paper. And that's it. That's the game. The first one's not really a game because there is no win condition, but it has game in the name, so who am I to debate this? It's kind of a shame that Tomodachi game has to end on these short games rather than a nice chunky one, since it means that we have to close out the video with what's like a small puff of air rather than a hearty big bang. The results of these games didn't leave much of an impression on me. In the week win game, Yuichi ends up taking the punishment for all 3 rounds. For rock, paper, fingers, Yuichi wins by playing scissors and tries to cut off the kidnapper's fingers, but passes out from losing too much blood. I don't really have any major points about this final stretch because it's so short besides that. I guess I actually kind of like the idea of rock, paper, fingers despite how stupid the name is, because of how it implements the consequences of losing a game in a very simple and straightforward way that still has a lot of weight to it. But aside from that, all that I've really got in store for it are a series of minor complaints as per usual. In episode 11, when Yuichi says mean things to Kokorogi because he cares, he goes off on her about how he hates people who can't decide anything for themselves. He does admit to Tenji later in that episode that he just said those things to push away Kokorogi so she doesn't need to be involved any further. That being said, it could have been an interesting little bit of character development if Kokorogi actually took Yuichi's words to heart and was able to make decisions for herself during the IRL game and take some of the punishment as a result. She certainly does try for the second one, but Yuichi won't let her get away with it, and as a result, Kokorogi ultimately leaves me with very little to write home about. Episode 12 goes absolutely batshit insane with the facial expressions as Yuichi gains way too much fine motor control of his facial muscles. It's by far the goofiest episode in the entire anime for this reason alone. The anime is trying to really amp up the tension and the scary vibes by distorting everything out of everybody's faces, but it just feels so silly to watch. If I was at any point where I could still take the anime's tense moments seriously, then perhaps I wouldn't feel about this episode the way that I do, but that's a ship that's long since sailed, capsized, and sunk to the bottom of the ocean. The first and second punishments for the weak win game are identical except in how many times it's inflicted. The third punishment is different, however. If Kokorogi takes it, then she has to undress in front of everybody, but if Yuichi takes it, then he gets his hand gouged 3 times. Obviously, you can't just have Yuichi undress 3 times, but since the goal of this punishment seems to be emotional damage, Yuichi's punishment should have also been an emotional one instead of a physical one. And I know I used the word deification a few times throughout this video in regards to how the anime treats Yuichi, but he gets holes put in his hand during episode 12, just like how Jesus Christ was nailed to the cross by his hands. I really don't know if this was an accident or not on the anime's behalf, but ever since I noticed this connection, I can't unsee it or unthink it. The admins busting open the warehouse door like a police raid and the flashback revealing this being pre-planned completely off-screen is pretty much peak Tomodachi game to me. The anime just really can't let it go with these plot twists and has to squeeze one in during the last few moments. Game 3 was all about how everything that was happening ended up being a step in Yuichi's plan, and that trend somehow finds a way to live on into the final episode. Like, it just doesn't get any more Tomodachi game than this, and now that it's been brought up, I think it's quite cute that Tenji just has the phone numbers of the admins with him for some reason that's never explained. It's so extremely convenient for the sake of enabling this plot twist, isn't it? And now that we're near the very end, I just want to do two more things. Firstly, here's a super special shout out to Manabu. I don't know if you could tell, but I don't really like any of the characters in this anime except for Manabu. He reads the rules at the start of every game and then just kind of fucks off and seems checked out after that point. Like, people are talking about who dated who and who's starving who, but Manabu's in the background in a completely different headspace, like he's not being paid enough to supervise these kids, and you know what, I can respect that. Secondly, there's a number of quotes that I wrote down during my rewatch just because I found these to be anywhere from a little to very funny because of how serious everybody takes everything. I already read a few of these off throughout this video, but here's just a couple more highlights that I don't want to waste. Again, with things like different subtitle providers, the dubbed versions, and perhaps even things lost in translation, these quotes might not be 100% accurate to what you've seen, but the vibes should carry over. Yuichi had a couple good ones in episode 1, like, "We had no idea how terrifying this game would be," and "At this rate, I'll begin to doubt everybody and my heart will turn black," but not to be left out, the black-haired admin lady hits us with, "But at this rate, they're all sure to fall straight into hell," which, to the anime's credits, that did basically happen. "Yuichi, you really are a sinful man," says Tenji in episode 3, and the one that'll always be the funniest to me is from episode 12. "But if you think about it, the real bad guys are the kidnappers who started the whole thing." Now, in context, this is a reasonable thing for Yuichi to say to try and make Kokorogi feel better. I don't want to dismiss that fact, but seeing this line without context is hilarious to me. It radiates the same kind of no shit Sherlock aura that people die when they are killed has. The more time I spend looking at Tomodachi game, the more I begin to think that the issues with it are fundamental. That's to say that the formula of letting a game progress along normally for 90% of it, only for Yuichi to come rampaging in like a bull in a china shop during the last 10% to completely flip the table on everybody is what might be the main source of a lot of these issues. I can't believe that I'm saying this, but perhaps Tomodachi game would have benefited from having more of the story be told from Yuichi's perspective. Having his schemes be almost entirely hidden from the viewer's view causes information picked up by the viewer to be not necessarily worthless, but greatly devalued, since they're always going to be missing critical components no matter how hard they try. In the same way, the setups leading to these reveals carry no weight to them, since once again, Yuichi is inevitably going to stomp it out. I never once felt satisfied with the anime's reveals of anything. This might be why I look upon Game 1 more favorably compared to 2 and 3, since that's the one that adheres to the formula the least, even if it's not completely detached from it. When the core of everything is problematic to begin with, the things that surround it, like the anime's incessant love for Yuichi, his absolute lack of flaws, and the weak cast of characters orbiting around him, have nothing to hide under. Through and through, Tomodachi game is broken from the bottom up, and I think the only way to fix it would be to totally change the approach to the story from the very start. It feels a little weird to end this video because I haven't really thought about how to close it out. I simply knew that I wanted to go on a tirade about Tomodachi game, and now that I've done it, it feels like a weight has been lifted off of my shoulders. Like I said not too long ago, it's kind of a shame that the video has to finish in a really deflating way where the vitriol has burned out into exhaustion, but alas, maybe that's a good thing, since who knows where we'd be if things somehow managed to get worse. Okay, thank you so much for watching the video. If you enjoyed it, then please consider liking it and perhaps even subscribing to the channel. Every little bit goes a long, long way. So now that the video is done, minus this outro, I guess, I just want to cover some background about it. This was unironically one of the hardest videos I've ever made to date. Probably is the hardest video I've ever made to date, and this was a result of the notes essentially being a giant compilation of every individual problem I had with the anime without actually taking the time to think about the overarching trends with these issues, because I just kept running into more and more problems that I needed to write down. So most of the time I spent writing, the script ended up being staring at the notes and just literally pondering my orb and thinking about the dots to connect. The main reason why this was so difficult for me was because most of these problems didn't fit cleanly into exactly one larger trend. It was almost always like a mix and match of different patterns that made organization very difficult. It was like a little bit of column A and a little bit of column B in every single case, and trying to come up with larger, broader strokes to be able to more concisely I say, put together all the points was by far the most difficult thing about this video. And also, I actually, it might be a little hard to believe because this video is like almost 2 hours long. It might be 2 hours long after I add this outro in, I'm not sure, but I never planned on actually making a full-ass video on just Tomodachi game by itself, and that was because the video before this one was the fall of 2022 seasonal speedrun where I covered Chainsaw Man, Bocchi the Rock, and Spy Family Season 2. That video was originally supposed to be for the entirety of 2022, where I picked at least one anime from every single one of the 4 seasons in 2022, and Tomodachi Game was one of those animes that I picked, that I initially planned on putting into the year in review video, but then I watched it and I realized that giving myself like 4 to 5 minutes would be nowhere near enough time to be able to vent out all the frustrations I have with the anime, so I decided to cut the year in review short, leave it to just the fall season, and now here's the result of that. That's why that video is called Seasonal Speedrun and not, a year in review or like what I missed in 2022, which is a shame. So, well, let's just take a moment of silence for Dress Up Darling, ya boy Kongming, and of course, most importantly, Rent-A-Girlfriend Season 2, because thanks to Yuichi's antics, those never got a video. But anyways, setting Tomodachi Game aside, the next video might either be Blue Lock or Summertime Rendering. I have not decided yet. There's a chance that it might not even be either of those animes if I end up watching them and I don't, feel motivated enough to make a video about either of those. Then it might be something else entirely. Who knows? I guess only time will tell. Speaking of things in the future, JoJo's Bizarre Adventure. I think it was either the Shadows House Season 2 video or the Arknights video, but in the outro for one of those videos, I said something like, I wanted to do work on a JoJo video at some point, but I was initially planning on doing it after finishing what was supposed to be the year in review video, but then this just kind of put a hard stop to that. But now that the largest thing on my chopping block is now complete, I figured now's probably a good time to actually start. But I will say, because I want to rewatch 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 and then go watch 6, That's a lot of stuff that I need to watch. So, and that's not even taking into account, writing, recording, and whatever the fuck else ends up happening for that video. So the TLDR is that a JoJo video is going to happen, but do not expect it for a long time. There will probably be several videos that come out before the JoJo one comes out, and that's because I'm going to the JoJo video. I'm going to be doing a lot of sort of secondary or tertiary work on it, because while I do want to make that video eventually, if I commit fully to just that video, I think I don't think there will be an upload on this channel for an amount of time that I am not satisfied with. So I do still want to work on other stuff so that I still have stuff to put up on this channel while that is being made. So don't expect it for a while. Funny how I said TLDR for that, but I probably ended up saying more for that instead of the actual announcement, or announcement in air quotes, for the JoJo video. But anyways, I mentioned the seasonal speedrun earlier. I want to do one for the spring season. I didn't do one for the winter season because, again, I got held up by this fucking video, but I want to do one for the spring season. I am currently sussing out candidates for it with nothing locked in, so we'll see how things pan out. I do plan on hopefully getting that video done and uploaded by around the time of the end of the season, or like just after the season ends, instead of like a whole last month after the season ends, like the last time. So, man, I am fried. This video was exhausting, and I am so glad to be done with it. I am not ultimately happy with the state of this video as is, but I feel like if I tried to, pick at every single detail and just kept, well, like I said earlier, kept pondering about every single little connection, every single little detail, I would probably never get this video done. So I just want to get this video done with and move on with some other stuff. So that's what we're doing here. Okay. All right. That's it. I'm actually going to be signing out now. Once again, thank you so much for watching, and take it easy.